It's hard to admit this at 60 years old, but I didn't really know who I was until about 5 years ago. I thought I did. I could describe myself. I had roles. I had opinions. I had preferences. But underneath all of that, I was constantly adjusting. Because my standards were flexible and my boundaries were soft, I was always slightly changing. I became who the room needed, who I wanted to impress, who I thought would benefit me most in that moment. I was a chameleon. Not dramatically, just subtly, changing colors depending on who I was around, saying yes to things that didn't fully fit, softening parts of myself, amplifying others. And because I was always adjusting, my emotions were never steady. They rose and fell depending on the room, the reaction I got, the approval I felt or didn't feel. There was no real baseline because there was no anchored version of me underneath it all. And when you live that way long enough, you don't notice you're performing. You just think you're adaptable. And that's where the real problem was. I had never actually formed my identity. I had only performed identities. And eventually, that creates a quiet but unsettling question. Who am I? Not who do I appear to be, not who works in this room, not who gets approval, but who am I when there is nothing to perform? I was only able to answer that question when I set standards, when I held boundaries, when I began to trust myself enough to put myself first, not selfishly, but honestly. That's what allowed me to define myself by who I wanted to become instead of what would get approval, attention, or advantage. And what I began to understand is this. Identity isn't something you decide once and declare. It forms after you build the other skills first. When you understand cause and effect, when you stop reacting for approval, when you set standards, when you hold boundaries, when you trust yourself enough to stay steady, that's when identity stabilizes. Identity isn't the foundation. It's the structure that finally stands because the foundation underneath it is solid. Becoming yourself, free from constant outside influence, isn't where you start. It's what becomes possible once everything else is in place. And that's why identity feels confusing for so many people. We're told to define ourselves early, to pick something, to decide who we are before we've built the internal structure that makes identity stable. Most young people feel pressure to define themselves before they've had enough real experience to know what actually fits. Identity becomes something you're supposed to figure out instead of something that is allowed to form. When you're young, your emotions change quickly, your environments change often, and the people around you expect different things from you in different areas. So it can feel like you're one version of yourself at home, another at school, another with friends, and another online. That doesn't mean that you're fake. It means your identity hasn't stabilized yet, and that's normal. Identity isn't something you decide in a moment, and it isn't something other people get to define for you. It forms through awareness, repetition, and time. And when you understand how that works, identity is allowed to form naturally. Here are 7 understandings of what identity is and how it's formed. Number 1, why identity feels confusing for most people. Identity feels confusing when your behavior keeps changing based on how you feel, who you are with, or what's expected of you. One day you feel confident, the next unsure. One situation brings out one side of you, another situation brings out something completely different. When that happens, it's easy to think, I don't know who I am. But most of the time, that confusion isn't about identity at all. It's about consistency. When your reactions are running the show, there isn't enough stability for identity to settle. You're reacting instead of choosing, adjusting instead of anchoring. And over time, that makes your sense of self feel scattered. When you're young, it's easy to mistake change for instability. Your interests change, your confidence shifts, your emotions fluctuate. That doesn't mean your identity is broken. It means your nervous system and your life experience are still developing. Identity doesn't show up fully formed. It forms gradually through contrast. You learn who you are by noticing what fits and what doesn't, what drains you, what steadies you. If you expect to know who you are too early, you skip that process. And when that happens, outside influence fills the gap. Most people who feel lost aren't lost at all. They're still gathering information. That isn't a flaw. It's a stage. Identity can't form from single moments. It needs experience, and that takes time. Number 2, reaction creates an unstable foundation. When your choices change every time your emotions change, your sense of self keeps moving. When you act one way when you're calm, another way when you're anxious, another way when you're trying to be liked, and another way when you feel pressured, there's no stable reference point inside you. There's no baseline to return to. That's exactly how identity stays unformed. Reaction often feels necessary because it creates the illusion of control. Doing something feels better than sitting with uncertainty. It feels active. It feels decisive. But when your actions are driven by your environment, who you're with, what's expected, what feels uncomfortable, you are not directing your life. You're managing discomfort. Over time, that becomes exhausting. You're constantly adjusting, explaining, correcting, reshaping yourself just to manage how you're coming across. The result isn't identity, it's confusion. Because your behavior isn't reflecting who you're becoming, it's reflecting how you feel in the moment. Slowing your reactions doesn't make you passive. It gives your choices space to line up with who you're actually building yourself into, instead of conforming to the moment just to feel better. Reactions feel urgent, but urgency doesn't build identity. Repetition does. Identity forms through what you do consistently, not what you do depending on your environment or who you're around. Number 3, identity is a pattern, not a decision. Identity isn't something you choose once and then live out forever. It becomes visible over time, through repetition, through how you respond when no one is watching, how you handle discomfort, how you treat yourself, what you do when things don't go your way. That's where identity actually shows up. This is why identity can't be forced through thinking alone. You don't discover who you are by asking better questions. You become aware of it by noticing what you do consistently when no one is pushing you, approving you, or watching you. Patterns don't lie. They show up when you're tired, when things don't go your way, when you're not trying to impress anyone. Those repetitions reveal who you are long before labels ever do. When you let patterns form instead of trying to perform an identity, something shifts. Identity stops feeling like something you're trying on and starts feeling like something you're settling into. You don't need to announce who you are. You don't need to dress or speak a certain way. You don't need to label yourself. Identity is personal, and it forms slowly through how you live and the choices you repeat, not how you perform or explain yourself. The pressure to figure yourself out usually comes from misunderstanding how identity forms. You don't find yourself by thinking harder. You reveal yourself by living your choices, not by reacting to the expectations around you. Number 4, when other people start defining you. When your identity hasn't stabilized yet, other people's words can feel powerful. Adults, teachers, peers, and culture often speak with certainty about who you could be, should be, or might be. And certainty sounds convincing, especially when you're still forming your own internal reference point. Young minds are designed to learn from authority. That's not weakness. It's how humans survive. We look to people who sound sure because certainty feels safe. But authority can be wrong. Confidence doesn't equal truth. When someone speaks with confidence about who you are or who you could be, it can feel convincing, especially if you're still unsure. Certainty has weight. It sounds like direction, even when it's just an opinion. And when that happens often enough, you start leaning on someone else's explanation of you instead of your own observations. And that's where confusion begins. Not because you can't know yourself, but because you stopped trusting what you were noticing in favor of what sounded more certain. And that's where pressure creeps in. Not because there's something wrong with you, but because you're trying to become something that doesn't fit who you want to be. Number 5, what can change and what can't. This is where things need to be clear, not emotional. You can choose how you live. You can choose how you express yourself, what roles you take on, what matters to you, and how you move through the world. Those choices matter. They shape your experiences, your relationships, and how you feel about yourself. At the same time, there are parts of you that are biological. They're part of how the body functions, develops, and responds to reality. Biology isn't a belief system. It doesn't shift based on how strongly something is felt or wanted. It's information, and information doesn't shift based on how you define yourself. When those two layers get blurred, confusion follows. When biology and personal expression are treated as interchangeable, stability erodes. And when young people are encouraged to draw conclusions that aren't grounded in physical reality, it doesn't create clarity, it creates doubt. Understanding the difference between what is and what you choose doesn't limit you, it grounds you. Reality doesn't take anything away. It gives you something solid to stand on while the rest of who you are continues to form. Number 6, why borrowed identity feels comforting. When you don't yet trust your own sense of stability, borrowing certainty from others can feel stabilizing. Labels and explanations feel grounding because they remove uncertainty. They give you something to hold on to when everything feels unclear. And in the beginning, that relief can feel real. Problem is that borrowed identity doesn't hold. It has to be maintained by outside approval. And when approval shifts, which it always does, the identity starts to wobble again. That's because borrowed certainty replaces observation. Instead of letting patterns form naturally, you step into a story that has to be reinforced. And anything that has to be constantly reinforced isn't stable. When the reinforcement wavers, confusion returns. This isn't failure, it's information. Real identity doesn't require constant explanation or defense. It grows quietly as you learn to trust what your own experiences keep showing you. Number 7, what changes when you stop borrowing certainty? When you stop letting other people define you, something quiet happens. You feel less pressure to explain yourself. You stop reshaping yourself to match expectations. You don't feel rushed to decide who you are. What you feel first isn't confidence, it's space. Space to think, space to notice, space to let yourself be inconsistent without panicking about it. That space turns your attention inward, away from how you're being perceived and toward what actually feels steady in your body and in your life. Instead of asking, who should I be, you start noticing, this feels like me. And that recognition doesn't come from performance or approval. It comes from repetition, from consistency. That's when identity starts forming in a quiet way, not as an announcement, but as alignment. Certain choices feel right, certain situations feel wrong, and you trust those signals more because you're no longer overriding them to match someone else's certainty. This is where identity begins to stabilize, not because you forced it, but because you stopped interrupting it. Identity is something that you live. You don't need to rush conclusions about yourself. You don't need to announce who you are. You don't need to figure everything out right now. Identity doesn't form by deciding who you are. It forms by living in a way that feels honest and sustainable over time. The more your choices line up, the steadier your sense of self becomes. You may not always have the language for who you are, and that's okay. Identity doesn't require words to be real. It shows up in what you protect, what you return to, and what you stop tolerating as you grow. When you let identity form this way, it stops feeling like a performance. It becomes who you are instead of something you put on. And over time, that steadiness turns into quiet confidence, not because you figured yourself out, but because you trusted your choices enough to let them shape you. And once that happens, you don't feel lost anymore. You feel anchored. In the description below, you'll find a companion PDF with simple questions to help you notice how these patterns show up in real life, along with a written version of this video that you can read, follow along with, and return to later. Take care. I will see you in the next one.